Kislev, the best in hybrid infantry, supported by good shock cavalry and a ton of bears for all tastes and sizes. That is Kislev for you. In this video I'll show you every unit from the roster before and after research, redline skills and XP. I'll also show you the lords and heroes and their abilities in campaign. So basically, your army does have some advantages. They have very good hybrid infantry, great cavalry, great single entities and good chariots. But there are some disadvantages and drawbacks. They do lack flying units altogether, and they have some specific laws of magic that you really need to learn how to use to be more effective in battle. So in terms of special abilities, here's what we have. We have the Buy Our Blood passive ability. So it only triggers once, okay? But it gives your unit unbreakable for 30 seconds once the leadership gets to wavering or lower. What this effectively implies is that nearly all of your forces will not rout immediately, and it will give you 30 extra seconds for them to stay in combat or obey your orders. Perfect to ensure you can have further control over what happens on the battlefield. This is a great army ability, and it encompasses so well with the playstyle of Kislev. Tsarina Katerin is your first legendary lord, a very good spellcaster with the lore of Ice. Katerin is also tagged as a decent melee combatant, although she does not have the stats in her unmounted form to do it properly. She has very low armor, she does have good melee attack with magical attacks and frostbite, which is always nice, fairly decent melee defense and good weapon strength, although not a lot of armor piercing here. So overall she's a great spellcaster that can hold on much better than others, but it should not be considered to go against the more dedicated melee lords or heroes. Just keep her safe and let her do the casting. For her abilities in campaign, she has the Guardian's Call. This basically summons a snow leopard. This is a very good unit to chase down large targets or just in general to assist Katerin. Then on the quests she can get the Frost Fang ability, an explosion with 2 charges, decent magical and armor piercing damage, although with a low radius. And finally you can get the more defensive Crystal Cloak. It's enabled whenever she's casting for 31 seconds and increases her ward save by 20%. A great support lord, Kastaltin, has some interesting stats overall. He doesn't have a lot of armor, he has great melee attack with flaming and magical attacks, decent melee defense, armor piercing damage focus, and he has all these numbers really high because he also has frenzy, which is giving him as well the immunity to psychology. So overall, he's great to be with your front line and support them, but do be careful with more dedicated fighters and his lack of armor, he'll fall easily. In terms of Kastaltin's abilities in campaign, there's several of them. Ursun's Ward, it replenishes his hit points when less than 25 hit points, so he only has regeneration when he's already kind of dying, really. Then the Courage of Sacrifice, also only affecting units if those units have less than 25% hit points, but it gives them more leadership and melee defense, which is always nice. Then we have Ursun's Roar, so the basic ones from the Patriarchs, but I'll show you here. Charge bonus and leadership to allies in range. You also have Daj's Song of Winter Sunlight, which gives allies in range minus 100% vigor per second, so it gives them vigor. Then we have Thor's Battle Hymn, which gives allies in range plus 40 melee attack. This is great actually when they're engaging in melee. And one of the best, which is the regeneration that it gives in an area to allies. 3 charges of, well, basically a heal per second. Very nice heal actually already. So it's really cool that you have, this possibility of having regeneration as this human faction. So, other than that, he also has the Enduring Devotion, which gives allies in range whenever he is in melee. It gives them melee defense, leadership, and immunity to psychology. And we also have the Blaze of Devotion here. Okay, there's a lot of them, like I said. So flaming attacks to allies and melee attack and more leadership when he's also in melee. So it all focuses on him being in melee, which is kind of kind of cool, but he's already, you know, kind of a squishy sort of character, so be careful. He also gains the Fireball spell here with the Arcane Vassal skill. So 4 charges of the Fireball spell, which is excellent, and still one more. The Brazier Mace of Ursun ability gives him weapon strength, of course, if his hit points are less than 50% base. So basically a lot of abilities that only kick in as he is, you know, very low, so it implies that you kind of need to put him in under pressure, okay? And that's when he's going to be most useful. So very, very niche idea for a lord, but it's still quite interesting to have. Boris Ursus is a great melee-focused lord with great armor but no shield, good melee attack and defense values, also with magical attacks and frostbite, which is always excellent. His main selling point is that he has armor-piercing damage and bonuses versus large, so he's already great at dealing with single entities or lords or heroes on mounts, which is excellent, and has a decent charge bonus as well, so ensure you make use of it. A much better melee lord overall for Kislev. For Boris's abilities in campaign, he does have the Fury of Ursun, augmenting the weapon damage, can cause terror, rampage, really good buff. Then we also have the Heroic Resilience, which is basically an augment, melee defense and leadership if the hit points are less than 50%. In addition, he can get the Shard Blade ability there, which is a direct damage in an area, 2 charges of that spell, also reducing speed significantly for enemies. Then we have an interesting armor, which increases damage. So increases base weapon damage and armor piercing damage, and also melee attack if the hit points are less than 50%. The Ice Witch, a typical caster lord with either the Ice or Tempest lores of magic, similar stats to other caster lords, really, not a lot of armor, very squishy overall. Now you have to keep her safe and out of combat and use her mainly for her casting abilities. Now note that she still has magical attacks and that frostbite, which may help in this endeavor. You know, try to make her hit something to reduce their speed and then run the hell out of there. So basically that's the sort of idea that you can use for her. Of course she can have a bear mount later on, which will help, but still she's always to be considered a caster and keep her safe without too much prolonged melee. Your Ice Witch also has the ability to summon a Snow Leopard via the Guardian Call, so as the previous one, very good unit to chase down large targets or just to cover your Ice Witch while she is in combat or to try and safeguard her. The Boyar is your last, the good armored melee lord with decent melee stats including good melee attack. It should be noted that it doesn't have magical attacks like the others. He has decent melee defense and good weapon strength, although not a lot of armor piercing, but it does include that bonuses versus infantry. So overall he's a nice lord that can also defend himself and go after enemy infantry and still fight some heroes or lords. Just be careful against anything that is specialized in defeating, of course, single entities. For his abilities in campaign, the Boyar can get the passive ability Heroic Resilience, an augment that is always enabled as long as the hit points are less than 50% base, giving 14 melee defense and 8 leadership. Very good to ensure that he survives just a little bit longer and becomes a little bit more tough to fight against. The Patriarch, a very decent support hero using the battle prayers that I will talk in a moment to benefit your army. So he has low armor, very low melee attack and melee defense values, also very low weapon strength without too much armor piercing. However, like other lords and heroes in Kislev, he can gain access to powerful bear mounts that change this. Still, overall better to use him as a support hero instead of a dedicated melee hero, since he'll suffer severely within that role against many other opponents. So in campaign, the Patriarch can get the Ursun's Roar. It's an area ability giving allies a 36% charge bonus and 8 leadership, which is always nice. Then you have a choice. You can choose either Da's Song of Winter Sunlight, which reduces or gives vigor per second minus 100% in an area to allies, or you can get Thor's Battle Hymn, This gives plus 40 melee attack to allies in range, and you can also have a healing ability, which is Celiac's Lullaby. 3 uses of a nice heal per second to allies in range, so you also have some healing with the Patriarchs. In addition to all this, he also has Enduring Devotion. Whenever he's in melee, he affects allies in range 35 meters with some more melee defense, leadership, and an immunity to psychology. Your caster hero of choice with the ability of having Ice or Tempest lores is the Frost Maiden. She's the typical caster, weak in melee, very low armor, melee attack, melee defense. She does have Frostbite, which is nice. It's always cool. You know, she can hit someone and then flee. That's the idea. Very low weapon strength, and of course, for the most part, even with the bear mount, I will ensure that she's safe. Treat her like any caster. Try to focus on her casting abilities, unless the enemy is really a very low threat to you. In abilities, you can also get the Guardian Call, so summoning the Snow Leopard unit. Very good to chase down large targets and still assist the Frost Maiden. Felix, a decent melee hero, more of a support one. He has decent armor but no shield, good melee attack and melee defense values, and he also causes armor-piercing missile damage for the most part, and bonuses versus infantry, so his main use will be against other enemy infantry. Or small targets, of course. Now, in terms of abilities, he does have Helping Hand, a buff that gives 40 melee attack and ward save to any lord or hero in 50 meters around him. It is great to ensure that they both survive and do additional damages, of course. Now, Kadag Gul gives him flaming attacks and more melee attack and even further bonuses versus infantry, making him really good at taking out enemy infantry, regardless of how strong they are. And finally, we do have the Blood Oath. This is his particular skill. He gives regeneration to up to 2 lords or heroes in range while he's in melee. Therefore, Felix is an amazing support hero for your other lords or heroes. Gotrek, everyone's favorite dwarf. He's a powerful melee hero without any armor, with a ton of melee attack and good defense, as well as magical attacks. He also does quite a lot of armor-piercing damage with the hefty bonuses versus large, so he's great at taking out anyone, especially any large targets. In terms of abilities, he does have, of course, the typical Deadly Onslaught and Foeseeker, and you also have the Rune Axe of Gotrek, which causes Dampen, removing magical attacks and spell resistance to enemies, and gives him 50% armor-piercing weapon damage. Gotrek's Doom also gives him 40 melee defense and 40% ward save, which is excellent for him to survive. This is how he survives. In addition, he's also has Heroic Fortitude, a passive ability regeneration with only 1 use. If his hit points are really low, less than 10%, he has the chance of gaining hit points. And if it wasn't enough, he also has Death Blow, giving him a lot of weapon damage and armor-piercing weapon damage when his hit points are less than 20%. So overall, an excellent fighter for your front lines. And by the way, he does have tons of hit points as well, which also helps. And then we have the new Ulrika, a nice hybrid hero. Ulrika gives some nice flexibility to your roster. She's a spellcaster with the lore of shadows, and then has decent melee stats. Not a lot of armor, but good melee attack and defense, as well as bonuses versus infantry there. Now, the biggest issue is that she also has a range attack, with a good range of 180, so she can even outrange most missile units with fairly good missile damage, actually. Now, she's overall a good combatant. Remember that she's undead, so she does have that crumbling issue, but her abilities actually she proves incredibly tough to kill. Let's start with that. So she's undead, yes, but she also has the hunger, so when in melee she'll replenish her hit points. Now she also has the Buy Our Blood ability from Kislev, so if the leadership ever goes down, she actually turns unbreakable. So it's amazing. The combination is just really crazy. Undead with unbreakable. And then she has great abilities, activated abilities, giving her physical resistance of 40% and melee defense, and the enemies nearby a reduced melee attack. So when this is active, yes, it only lasts 33 seconds, but basically she's really unharmed during that hard. Then she can imbue with blind, so basically reducing several stats of the enemy while also heavily increasing her accuracy. And in addition, she can also have the Silver Dagger, a more basic bonus in itself, but she does get magical attacks, which is useful against those with physical resistance, of course, and more weapon damage and armor-piercing weapon damage. So incredibly tough to kill this this hero. Always a good choice if you can have her in one of your armies, by all means. So we begin with Armored Cossars, a very nice hybrid unit, but still much more of a holding infantry. You can see this by having very good armor, good silver shields, so they'll deflect a lot of those missile units fire. And then we have melee attack and melee defense values, very good, very average based, you know, and these get increased later on, more on that later. The weapon strength is still very good as well, you know, not a lot of armor piercing, but still. And then they still have that hybrid attack. They have some missile range, and that missile is kind of fine because it's a pistol, so it's pretty cool unit to hold the line, do some damage before they close in. So yeah, very much a very good hybrid unit. In the late game you can field these guys for sure. They'll become just much better at tanking missiles because of that nice missile resistance there added to the silver shield, so you can imagine that. Still very good melee attack and melee defense, but they gain much better missile values. So the upgrades focus on their missile values, which means that they'll just do a lot more damage before the enemy closes in. Perfect for a holding infantry unit. And now for Regiment of Renown, the Watchman in the Night, Armored Cossars Regiment of Renown. So very good regiment, really. It shifts the shield, so they don't have a shield, they still have that armor, in favor of a second blade, and it does cause frostbite, which is excellent. With the coloring of that blade, I wish it would give them magical attacks, but it doesn't. And then, of course, other than improved stats, they do get that bonuses as infantry. So a ton of weapon strength as well, because they also get that frenzy ability, which is excellent. In addition to that, they also cause the immunity to psychology to allies in range. That's why the previous Armored Cossars had that ability, even though I didn't mention that. So yeah, overall a very nice Regiment of Renown, perfect to have in the middle of your ranks to ensure that you can dish out some damage to the enemy infantry. So if the idea is to take care of enemy infantry, look no further for the Armored Cossars with great weapons. They still have that missile attack, it's the same as the other Armored Cossars, but they trade off their shield for a nice armor-piercing weapon. So basically the main idea from these guys, they do have less melee defense, but they're still quite tanky. They can hold on the line against, you know, anything that doesn't have a lot of missile support, of course, because they lose that shield, but they're much better at causing damage to the enemy, especially armored opponents. Late game, they also get the same thing, the same treatment as the other Armored Cossars. They get much better ranged stats overall, so they will be able to do a lot more damage before closing in for the fight, and still that missile resistance, perfect for them. So very good idea of a hybrid unit here for even to your late game. You can use these guys very well into the late game, just with those upgrades, of course. If you're looking for the ultimate holding infantry for the Kislev army, look no further for the Tsar Guards. They're very heavily armored and shielded, still a little bit more armor than the Armored Cossars, much better melee defense, also melee attack, and weapon strength values. They still have a lot of damage. These are kind of like Chaos Warriors kind of troops, a little bit better actually in some stats. Overall, in the late game, they will just be really tanky. They can even gain more spell resistance, tons of melee defense reaching 76. So yeah, definitely these guys will just be exactly what you want them to be. Holding infantry, hold that line. Don't forget that they all have that Buyer Blood ability, which makes them so much more resilient. Yeah, these guys, they'll likely die to the last, fight to the last man standing before even considering routing for sure. And if you want the ultimate killing machine for the infantry of the Kislev army, the Zagad with great weapons. Trading that shield, the same idea with the Armored Cossars with great weapons. They trade the shield for an armor-piercing weapon, this time a double blade, basically a double-handed sword. So overall, it not only gives them armor-piercing base value, but it also gives them a nice bonuses versus infantry. So these guys, they are the ones that you're going to send against the enemy infantry for sure, to wreck stack them up. Notice that they do lose a ton of melee defense in the purpose of getting much more melee attack, so that's their main usage. An additional note for them is their nice charge bonus, so ensure that you always charge them in to get the most effective the most effective use of them. Now, in terms of the late game, they still get that spell resistance, which is nice, but they benefit from all those buffs for the melee defense and the melee attack, so they can even overcome the weakness of having that low melee defense, which is perfect. That's exactly what we sometimes wish for these units, for them to, you know, through the upgrades benefit so much that they suddenly become a much better holding infantry, which these guys can become. All that they would miss out for that is actually a shield. So very good unit, well into the late game for the Kislev army. And time for a Regiment of Renown, the Dage's Hearth Blades, sorry, I thought it was Heart. The Tsar Great Weapons Regiment of Renown. So the main idea from these guys, alongside the upgraded stats, is the fact that they do cause flaming attacks. They still have that nice weapon strength, armor piercing, with the bonuses versus infantry. And not only that, they do have one ability, one use of Dage's Song of Winter Sunlight, an augment in an area, reducing the vigor per second for the army. So basically they'll gain more vigor, which is excellent. Affects all allies in range of that 35-meter range, and in addition they do have a nice 40% fire resistance, so they're very good into that niche as well. If the enemy has flaming attacks, by all means use these guys against those enemies. Useful for instance against Chaos Dwarves, for example. Just bring one army with at least. It's sad that they're just a Regiment of Renown, but at least you have one unit that can go in and dish out a ton of damage. That's what I want to say. So yeah, very good Regiment of Renown for the Kislev army. Kossars, the very staple of the Kislev army. They're very much a very good hybrid unit. For the most part, these guys are still the missile infantry. You use them because they do have that nice range and missile strength, of course, without too much armor piercing, but still it's pretty decent, of course, especially for how early you can get these guys. And then they have decent melee stats, good melee attack, good melee defense, still decent weapon strength, you know. Not a lot of armor and then not a lot of leadership as well, so be careful. It's not like they're designed to withstand the line. They're just good at ensuring that they poke a little bit into the enemy so that the enemy is weakened. When they come to fight them, they can withstand that. That's the idea. And then in the late game, they can definitely get much better, especially in terms of their range capabilities, because they do get a little bit more range, more ammunition, and more armor piercing missile strength, of course, and all the other buffs. Do note that there's some green here. Those are the buffs under Kostaltin. So under Kostaltin they just become that little bit much better, to the point that they become a good mid-tier infantry. So always remember, of course, that they are lightly armored and they have no shield, so they have their weaknesses for sure. And then a variation of the Kossars is the Kossars with spears. Of course, as you may suspect, everything is pretty much the same. Do note that they do have a little bit more melee defense in comparison, and that their weapon strength does have that nice bonus versus large. So these guys are much better at holding the flanks against enemy cavalry. You know, low quality cavalry, they can withstand them for sure, but don't put them against, you know, a Dreadsaurian or anything like that, because that's not their main goal. Their main purpose is to ensure that, you know, enemy skirmishers, for instance, won't do a lot of damage to them. Even if they try to charge them, they can withstand them. So that's the sort of idea behind these Kossars. They're cheap, and you can find them in you can field them in great numbers if you need. Overall, in the late game, of course, they become a little bit better in terms of missile unit. It's still very much a good hybrid, so you never have to worry too much about your archer units being attacked, because they can withstand a little bit more. And then, of course, their ammunition, their range, their armor piercing missile damage gets increased, which is always excellent. And now to a very cool hybrid unit, the Gun Great Axe Infantry. I love that idea. So basically, these guys, they do have not only decent melee stats, but also armor piercing weapon strength, so they're very good at it. They do have that extra armor, no shield, which is kind of a shame. That would make them such a nice unit. But still, maybe overpowered then. Of course, the main benefit here is that not only they have armor piercing weapon strength, but also missile strength is also armor piercing. So overall, these guys are perfect to withstand any armored opponents, any chaos warriors, for instance, or anything like that. They can reach out and kill them from afar, or anything, any single entities that you can focus down. They'll get them down really fast. Remember line of sight with these guys, and all will be good. Now, in the late game, they do become quite the hybrid infantry. I mean, look at those values in terms of leadership, in terms of melee attack and melee defense. They will withstand their ground against nearly anything, and especially, in particular, a good advantage that they have in terms of their range is that they get the range attack. They get more range, more ammunition, more armor-piercing missile damage, which is amazing, and even bigger detail is the reload speed. They'll fire so fast in the late game that they'll melt anything that you wish them to melt. So basically, a very awesome unit to have in nearly any Kislev army. You should have like 4 or 5 of these for sure, and you'll never feel bad for it. Now, one of my favorite units in the roster, the Ice Guards with Swords. A very nice hybrid unit. They do have, well, quite a lot of different stuff, so let me start. First, they're average armor. They have average armor. That's the average that you can get. They don't have a shield, so be careful with that. Still, they have decent melee attack and melee defense values. A little bit poor on the melee defense compared to the melee attack. They're much better in offense. They have magical attacks and frostbite, which is excellent. It will reduce the enemy speed. And their weapon strength does have a bonus versus infantry. So they're good at holding the line against enemy infantry. Weaker infantry, of course. Nothing that they don't have armor piercing, so be careful with heavily armored targets. Their main advantage, of course, is their missile range, because they have 160 magical attacks and they cause frostbite as well. And when I said they don't have a lot of armor piercing, they still have enough to deal with a lot of enemy targets. So definitely a unit that you can bring it with any army for sure. They still have that spell resistance, so it's really cool. They don't suffer too much if the enemy targets them with spells. In the late game, they just become quite a menace. You can use these guys definitely as not a doomstack, but you can use these guys as infantry for sure. These girls, sorry, as infantry for sure in the army, because those values, they reach very significant values, over 50 in melee attack and melee defense, which is always nice. And yeah, of course, the main upgrades that you get are for their missile focus, but for sure they can hold the line if you need them. Especially, just don't put them against heavily armored targets, because that's not their main goal, but otherwise they'll do just great. Now, if you are afraid that the enemy may flank your archer force, well, you can bring some Ice Guards with glaives. The same idea as the other Ice Guards, but they have some better stats, because they have better melee defense, which I love that they have this, and they have armor piercing based weapon strength, which is excellent, and the bonuses versus large. So they're much better at dealing with enemy cavalry, enemy large entities for sure. That's their main goal. But of course they can still hold the line with that armor piercing against enemy armored opponents. Their missile strength is about the same. They still have that frostbite, which is always nice. The armor piercing missile damage is nothing to shy about, which is always good. In the late game, you can definitely field like 6-7 of these in an army if you wish. Maybe 4 or 5 if you only wish to use them as flanking, whatever. They're really good at being a hybrid unit. If you focus on them, for sure they'll become a very good holding infantry, especially in the flanks. Just be wary that they don't have a lot of armor or shields, so they still have their vulnerabilities. Of course, the main focus of the research and Redline is in their missile capabilities, which they're very well enhanced, especially with the armor piercing missile damage. So yeah, very much a very potent unit to use well into the late game. Kossovite Dervishes, a very fast, lightly armored cavalry. Basically, their main course, you already know about these guys. They're good in charging, you know, enemy archers, enemy backlines, artillery. That's their sole purpose. They do have that vanguard deployment, which helps in that regard. So, very good speed, very good charge bonus. That's what you want from these guys. In the late game, they do become quite better, to the point that they're kind of like a medium. They step up to becoming a medium, fast cavalry unit, and especially it's a good thing that their speed also increases and that their charge bonus also increases, so they just become much better at doing their job. Note that under Consultant, they're just slightly much better with those enhanced melee defense and leadership values, so don't overlook these guys, especially in the early game. They can give you such a much easier early game if you focus on them. Then we have one of the favorite units of all for the Kislev roster, the Winged Lancers. A very nice shock cavalry, really. They do have quite decent armor and the bronze shield, so that's excellent. They can survive those missiles if they try to hit them. They do still have quite potent speed and a ton of charge bonus, but not a lot in terms of melee attack and melee defense or weapon strength. Their main focus is precisely their charge. They'll do a lot of damage. Just make sure that you get the most benefit of it, and it all will go well. They're classed as an anti-infantry, but they don't have an anti-infantry bonus. They don't have a bonus versus infantry, so be careful with that. But they also cause fear, which is excellent. Now, into the late game, what we have in terms of changes, overall, they just become better at what they do. They become a little bit more tankier with more armor. They have a lot of increases in terms of their speed and charge bonus, so that's their sort of purpose. They don't flee from that. They don't get a lot of benefits for their melee attack or melee defense or weapon strength, so they'll always be a shock cavalry, that's for sure, just a little bit better at that job. If you want an upgrade from those Winged Lancers, you have the Griffin Legion. So they have a lot more armor and still that bronze shield, which is excellent. They trade that off for a little bit of speed, so they're less fast. You know, they're slower than the Winged Lancers. Better melee attack and melee defense stats, to the point that they can kind of reach later on some good melee stats overall. They have a bit more weapon strength, so don't consider that they're just a bit of an upgrade. They upgrade nearly everything here, and still that nice charge bonus. They also cause fear. Of course, it would be poor if the Winged Lancers caused it and the Griffin didn't, so the Griffin Legion still causes fear. Overall, in the late game, they just become much better at their job. I keep saying this, but they get an upgrade for the weapon strength, and also, of course, because of the XP, you can get decent values for their melee attack and melee defense. This just allows you to ensure that whenever you send them, you don't have to completely control if their charge has worn out, because of course they can still handle a little bit better in melee. Overall, a very decent unit for the Kislev roster. Now to one of the best units in the roster, the Warbear Riders. Heavily armored, they don't have a shield compared to the other cavalry units, so be wary of that. Of course, they trade that off being a much tankier force overall, because they're monstrous cavalry. Of course, only 16 of them in a unit, but their melee attack, melee defense status are really good, and then we have such a nice weapon strength with the bonuses versus large. So these guys, you can send these in against the Demigryph Knights with halberds, for instance, or anything that tries to dominate the flanks. You can dominate with these guys, especially in the late game, because in the late game they do get some upgrades where I'd like them to get, which is their weapon strength, their armor, their melee attack and melee defense values, to the point that these guys really will do a lot of damage in their charge, but they are melee cavalry. You can send these guys and just let them do their job. They'll finish off most enemies with ease. And if you want a Regiment of Renown, the Oath Brothers of Torn. The Warbear Riders Regiment of Renown. They changes the color of the bear, which is always nice to see. They do have quite an advantage, not only the increased stats, but they have magical attacks, which is always excellent to have. So very good against those units that will suffer more for that. Now, in addition, they have a nice ability, which is the Call of Tor. It's a bombardment spell, really. It causes blind with whoever they target, and it doesn't affect friendly troops. For the most part, of course, it does cause some damage, but even the blind effect is already really crazy to have. So it's excellent for them to ensure that they will fight and defeat whatever target you put them. If they are under stress, you can put that bombardment, and suddenly they'll defeat that enemy without issues. So a very good ROR unit for the Kislev army. Starting things off with the horse archers, they're very good. They're decent melee combatants, really. Not a lot of armor, but still very decent stats. They can hold on their own if they need to pursue some light archers, for instance. Of course, their main focus is the fact that they do have quite a lot of range. Don't sleep on this. Typically, horse archers don't have this much, and it helps them that they do. Not a lot in terms of missile strength, but still, that's the sole purpose, to harass the enemy, to cause them to make mistakes that you can capitalize on. And that helps. It helps that you have Vanguard deployment. It helps so much that you have firewalls moving. So these guys are a pain for the enemy to deal with. And remember, they still have that Buy Our Blood. So even if they are caught, you can still have some significant advantages trying to get them away, or they'll survive long enough to change the side, the tip of the battle, basically. Overall, in the late game, and by the way, when I mention late game, is by the time these guys reach their maximum, they're already very good units, really. They can withstand a little bit more punishment in melee, of course, especially under Costalton. That's the green values there, and they become much faster. Overall, their missile strength is increased overall, and they get a nice missile resistance. So overall, they just become much better and quite an annoyance to enemies. So even in the early to mid game, after you get a couple of these guys, you can still use them against enemy artillery, for instance, flying units, to just capitalize on the fact that they are fast and the enemy will have a hard time dealing with them. Now to even more bears, the light war sleds. So basically this is a chariot type unit. You can use them as a chariot. They have decent armor, melee defense. Of course they're lightly, so they don't have a lot of armor compared to the next one, but still decent armor overall. Melee attack and melee defense, better melee attack than melee defense values. This is quite typical for chariots, really. But the main advantage is their weapon strength. It's very good, very high, with the bonus versus infantry, focused on armor piercing, and then they have a ton of ammunition and a cool range, actually, for an armor piercing missile strength. So overall, these guys are no joke. You can have these guys well into the late game for sure with any army. They'll wreck a lot of targets, even just with their range stats overall, and then you can charge them in and they'll still do a lot of damage. And note, of course, as a good chariot, range chariot, they have a fire whilst moving and they cause fear. So all very good things for this chariot unit. Overall, in the late game, the most important stats to note here is that they are focused in their ranged departments. So overall, they get even more range, more ammunition, to the point that you'll never need so much. Even better armor piercing values, and especially the reload speed. It's really cool. They get some nice missile resistance, which helps against, because it's one of their weaknesses, of course. They don't have a lot of armor and they may be susceptible for against enemy missiles. So of course, overall, you can bring these guys forever and have no issues with your battles for the Kislev campaign. But if you want the ultimate bear killing machine, well, that's the heavy war sleds. And they don't kill bears, well, they may kill bears as well. Look at that armor, 110, it nearly doubles. Actually, it doubles from, it does even more. Previously, the light war sleds didn't have so little armor. They have a little bit more. So now the advantage is much bigger. So much better armor. The melee defense, melee attack values still persist. Same weapon strength overall. They're very good. Armor piercing with the bonus versus infantry. Their range still really decent with a nice missile strength. So overall, just the most upgraded version from the light sleds. Still, in terms of the difference between the light sleds and this, it's mainly, if not mistaken, the speed. But overall, yeah, both variants would do just nicely. Now, in terms of the late game, the same thing. The advantages are more into the range department, so their range attack becomes much better. It fires much faster. It adds a little bit more range and more ammunition that you will need. So overall, a very nice addition to your roster. So your first monster, the Snow Leopard, don't neglect this guy. You know, sometimes people think, oh, it's just one, but they're so good. They're really fast, they don't have a lot of armor or leadership really, but their melee attack is really powerful, and they have frostbite, not a lot of melee defense, so these guys are kind of like a glass cannon, really. Such a beautiful unit, by the way. It's really awesome to see them in combat. The main advantage is their weapon strength, because it's armor piercing and with the bonuses this is large. So they're very good at tracking, for instance, enemy lords heroes or heroes in mounts. These guys are crazy good against enemy artillery as well. They're really fast, so you can position them where you want them. That's the advantage. If you have figure out a use for using these guys, and they'll never fail you. Of course, don't send them against enemy cavalry or enemy spears, for instance. That's not their take. What they're supposed to do is precisely to chase down those targets, you know, like a leopard would do. Chase down those targets, ambush them, wherever. That's the main purpose. Remember to take the benefit of the charge bonus. They still have nice physical resistance and the causing fear, which is always excellent. Now, in terms of the late game, again, don't neglect them. They get precisely what you would wish. A little bit more resilience. So they get a better weapon strength, of course, more melee attack and more melee defense, and some more armor. So overall, they'll just be tankier, they'll do a little bit more damage, they'll defeat the enemy faster, which is precisely what you want from this single entity. Honestly, you can bring these guys late game if you know the typical targets. You can, you know, bring a couple of them just to charge the enemy lord or enemy caster really fast and wreck them. That's the sort of purpose that you can find for these guys. One of my favorite units in the roster. Now, of course, if you prefer the big single entities, let's go for the Elemental Bear. Armored, no shield, but who needs that with that amount of hit points, of course. This is quite I would say, a colossal monster, honestly. He reaches that point. The melee attack, he does have quite a lot. Not a lot of melee defense. He's rather squishy, but he does have magical attacks and frostbite. Good luck running away from him. The weapon strength is colossal. It has a ton of armor piercing, which is great. That's the main purpose. And he's also unbreakable. Good luck getting rid of him. In addition to that, he has a fiery breath. Well, not a fiery, a coldly breath. That's what I'm going with. So he can use this only if he's out of melee. The main idea for this is that you use this range attack before engaging. Try to set him up on the side if you need, but don't look too much for it. Just make sure that you benefit from that. It will decrease the enemy's speed as well. So even if they try to run away, if they made a mistake, well, no going out of the range of the Elemental Bear after that. So very good. Just ensure that you always benefit from that Elemental Breath. And in addition, they do have a chilling aura, a passive ability, which reduces yet again the speed. So overall, it just works so well with the basis of the Kislev army. Kislev has so many hybrid units. They can nearly all engage in melee and have some missiles. So of course, if the enemy cannot move fast, they'll just take more damage from those missiles, which is perfect. So it all adds up, and it's really great. In addition to that, of course, they do cause terror. Such a big unit like this will cause terror, and they have a nice physical resistance. And in terms of the late game, well, by all means, bring these guys. Look at that melee attack enhancing so much. Melee defense, not so much. It does overcome a little bit of the difficulties. They get a little bit more armor, of course, and still more physical resistance. But the main benefit is their weapon strength getting even higher, that melee attack becoming so powerful. Yeah, overall, a very nice single entity for the Kislev roster. Time for a nice Regiment of Renown. I love this type of Regiment of Renown. The Frozen Heart of Winter Elemental Bear Regiment. So basically, upgraded stats, of course, still the same thing. A colossal monster, lots of armor, unbreakable, causes terror, armor piercing, etc. Main difference, he still has that fiery breath, the elemental breath, okay? And then he has the Heart of Winter, one charge of this, which is great. This one causes a ton of damage to the enemy the longer they stay there. So they benefit so much from having all of that speed debuff stacking, because the enemy won't be moving and will take such a long direct damage in that area. So basically you can send this guy into the middle of the enemy infantry. They'll all be slower. You can poke them with your missiles, and he just acts like a massive tank overall over there. In addition, of course, he still has that chilling aura, as if he needed even more things to slow, and the physical resistance and the cause terror. So overall, a great Regiment of Renown unit to use in any army. It can shine on its own as well. So by all means, you can use them either with a legendary lord or with a normal regular lord to enhance that army. That's the sort of idea that I would bring. Time for the only artillery unit, but it's quite a nice one. It's only a 1 entity, single artillery unit, but it's quite nice. So it has a lot of armor, which you wouldn't expect, of course, decent hit points, decent melee attack, not a lot of melee defense, so it's still squishy, good speed, which is always nice, and a nice weapon strength with a bonus versus infantry. So is this a chariot? Well, it can act as one. It does have a nice ammunition, quite a ton of range, which is excellent, and a nice armor-piercing missile damage, which it doesn't show here, but it's quite accurate as well. Even though it looks more like a mortar, countering it being like acting more like a cannon. Really, it is quite accurate. So it still causes fear. So the main advantage of this is not an artillery unit that the enemy can easily send out, you know, just some squishy unit to deal with, because they'll have to contend with such a powerful unit in combat that, well, it's going to be difficult for them. It's going to be difficult for them. Now, in the late game, they get quite a considerable amount of buffs, even to their armor, which is great, even to their melee defense and melee attack. So they still become quite a nice chariot to have around, especially in the later stages of the game where the ammunition doesn't count, or where you cannot be attacking because, you know, the enemies are all over you, so you have to engage in melee. But a nice idea here is the range. Look at that. They get such a powerful range that you'll probably most likely always have the first shot with these guys. And of course their missile damage is really large, so it's great. I like to have a couple of these guys with some sleds, you know, in the flanks as well, because they'll do so much damage to the enemy before they close in, and of course then they can still maul everything. As you see that bear who wants to maul something, they can still maul something with their claws, and overall it's a very wonderful unit. Really love this addition to the Kislev roster. And that is it, all units currently for the Kislev roster before and after XP, Redline skills, and research. I hope this helps you guys to better have an idea of how your units will behave more into the late game as well, and to build up different army compositions and to be inspired. That's the sort of idea behind these videos. I hope everything goes alright with your campaigns, and have a wonderful day. Bye bye.